Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and welcome to Select Star from Data Lake. This is a podcast where I like to talk about data topics, and particularly ones that revolve around the data lake and the data lakehouse. And in today's episode, I want to talk about sort of like FUD in the world of data lakehouse table formats. Now, one thing I've learned, okay, so for those who don't know my history a little bit, basically I was hired by Dremio about a little over 2 years ago. And basically my main role has been to talk about data lakehouse table formats, in particular like Apache Iceberg. And it's been a hot topic, I must say. Like when I create content in this space, it's definitely more popular than any other content I put out there. And I put out all sorts of content on catalog versioning, on data lakehouse architecture, all sorts of really great stuff that is absolutely fascinating to me. Um, but people really love that conversation about data lakehouse table formats, and it can sometimes get very contentious because there are a lot of financial interest in that. Because essentially, it is the key point. Like the bottom line is like the format that your data is in determines sort of what tools can talk to your data, okay, and also determines which companies kind of have an advantage. Okay, so if everyone's using a format that your company has control over, well, then you're going to have a large market advantage versus if everyone talks in a format that doesn't necessarily have that same sort of centralized influence. So it can get very contentious. Okay, there's companies that really build their business on particular formats. Okay, so yeah, it gets contentious. So essentially, recently, Jacques Nadeau, co-founder of Sundeck, and also a co-founder of Dremio, where I work, um, basically put out this video piece where they kind of basically did a comparison of table formats. And there was one metric that was mentioned, which was like search results, which was actually something when I wrote my original sort of comparison of table formats. I didn't go with, mainly because I ran into a similar issue that in basically what happened is that Kyle Weller of One House wrote an article criticizing this video. So I think while the vast majority of the video had very fair metrics, and the basically if you read an article I'll put out today, which I'll link to in the description of this podcast, I kind of discuss it, and I'll link to the pieces here so you can kind of see it. But I do think it's like fair on the search results that it's really hard to use search results as a metric for this. One, because the terms iceberg and delta lake both get a lot of really like there's actually a thing in nature called the delta lake. So you get a bunch of like nature park stuff, or you get just iceberg. You get icebergs. So there's a lot of like unrelated stuff. So oftentimes you'll get like narrow results if you do like strictly Apache Iceberg, Apache Hudi. But again, you're also going to miss stuff because there are times where people just say iceberg. Okay, and it doesn't necessarily, and again, what those results are don't necessarily reflect people using the format. Like, for example, you could be writing a piece that's criticizing the format, and that would still be counted as a search result. Um, so I agree that it's not the best metric. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not a metric to show. Okay, and for people to kind of come up with their own different methodologies to show what that metric may look like, in the same way that Kyle Weller kind of altered the methodology in his article to kind of show what he thinks would have been the right way to execute that statistics. Again, I don't think either one necessarily is useless. I think, okay, taking a look at sort of like aggregate, hey, if I just look up the term iceberg, again, you're going to have mixed results, but it's not necessarily meaningless. But again, the different way you do sort of determine what search results are going to determine sort of different, tell different stories or have different implications. So generally, so what I did in light of all this, I wrote an article to kind of focus on sort of like what do I think is important, because beyond these two pieces, which I linked to in my blog, there's this just whole world of other articles that try to take a look at like performance and features and say, hey, I have this feature, you don't have this feature. There are some legit feature differences, particularly, I mean, again, I know I'm sort of like the iceberg, one of the biggest iceberg advocates around, but like there is a legit architectural difference that allows Iceberg to have features like partitioning evolution and hidden partitioning, which has to do with just sort of like the way it's metadata structured that isn't necessarily easily replicated. But again, when it comes to like hidden partitioning, Delta Lake has a very similar feature in the form of generated columns. I mean, there is a functional difference in the sense that it is more of a compute flavored feature, in the sense that like it's not necessarily it's not a function of the way the metadata is stored. It's more of a function of how the write job is done. So this is why like there was like some contention that, you know, for a while, maybe even still, that you could only use generated columns when you're working on Databricks specifically, and not just Delta Lake using the Delta Lake libraries. I think that might have changed recently though. You know, but you could kind of get a very similar feel. There are some legit differences as far as like, hey, what's actually written in your Parquet files and things like that. So there are like actual distinctions, but at the end of the day, like those distinctions are not the biggest deal. I imagine eventually Delta Lake and Hudi will figure out sort of how to replicate that in a more ergonomic way in the future. Okay. I mean, there's aspects of the way their formats are architected that make it hard. Okay. Just because of sort of like where the metadata is tracked and how the metadata is tracked, which again then has certain pros. So again, it's pros and cons for all three of these formats. Okay. Each of these formats make it a decision as far as how they're going to do things based on what they were optimizing for. Okay. So again, the point is like the features, like they're constantly taking ideas from each other. And that's a good thing about having three formats, that they push each other to be better. And you have three better formats than you would have if had any of them just become the dominant format out of the gate. But I think what's more important for more people is just their ability to get the work they need done. Okay, most people generally don't want to have to overhaul the way they do things to go from point A to point B. Okay, so then in that case, this is why I think ecosystem matters a lot. Because if you work with the tools that you're already using, then it's going to be much more easier to adopt, much more likely to adopt. Okay. Two, also just being able to be easy to use. Okay, you could be the fastest thing in the world. For example, I can imagine some car that is faster than any car in the world, but requires some extra knobs. Like I think I mean, I'm not a car expert, if I remember right. I think it is possible to go faster when you're using like a manual transmission than an automatic transmission. But most people still drive automatic because it's easier. Okay, and the marginal benefit of driving manual isn't worth the effort for a lot of people. It's worth the effort for some people, but not all the people. So I think the ergonomics of any of these formats, and again, those ergonomics are going to come in quality of documentation, being able to actually read and understand how this format works and how I can use it. Okay, having clarity. Okay, knowing what is the format and what are tools of the engines, and having clarity of what I can and can't do. Okay, these are the things that are going to reduce frictions, and people are going to like when they don't have frictions. Okay, and again, this is not purely me just trying to like criticize problems that other formats may have, but also pointing out where other formats can improve. Okay, my hope isn't to be like, hey, okay, well, Apache Iceberg's documentation is a lot better now and a lot clearer, and there's a very clear delineation between sort of its features versus what the engines provide. But also me hoping that, the other formats also make large strides in providing better documentation and more clarity between sort of like, hey, this is what the format provides. Here's what tooling around that format provides. So there's clarity for the end user. Because again, that is going to affect adoption. Okay, people want clarity, they want use. Ergonomics matters. Okay, people don't like confusion. So ecosystem, ease of use, and openness. Okay, and again, in this case, you basically Iceberg and Hudi both have a pretty strong story in this regard, in the sense of having a lot of contributors to their core repo. Okay, and a lot of people are like, well, when it comes to like Delta Lake, people will be like, well, there's also the Go repo, the Rust repo, and they have lots of contributors. So why doesn't that factor to the calculation? The reason being is that where new features come in, where the direction of the format gets decided is in the core repo. Okay, basically that's what determines what direction the format goes, what features are prioritized, what features even become available in the open source implementation, things like that. So whoever's contributing to that, whoever has control over that particular repo, has control really over the project itself. which is why taking a look at the, in my statistics that I've compiled over the years, I look specifically at that. Okay. And again, the criticism isn't saying that any of these formats are bad. Like, honestly, at the end of the day, like, all these formats are, at the end of the day, at this point, very mature, very performant. Like, again, performance and features aren't really the deciding factor anymore because they're so mature. It's going to come down to, again, the larger ecosystem, the ease of use, because, again, at the end of the day, like, you can have all the bells and whistles in the world, but if you can't figure out how to use it, you're not going to take advantage of those bells and whistles. And then 3, sort of, that open ecosystem, because you want a competitive ecosystem of tools you can use, so that way your data isn't sort of limited to X number of tools to not just read and write. It's not just reading and writing. It's also like optimizing your tables, taking advantage of advanced features on your tables, okay, being able to catalog your tables in multiple places, okay, not just in a particular vendor. Okay, so for example, when it comes to Iceberg, yes, Dremio provides a lot of these features, but we are not the only place you can catalog your tables. We're not the only place you can query and write Iceberg tables. There's lots of different options. Okay, so that means we have to do our best to be the best at providing you, that Iceberg functionality, because we're not the only ones. And that sort of open ecosystem, that open competitive ecosystem, is basically better for the consumer in the long run. Now, one can be said that technically right now you have competition between the 3 formats, so that pushes everyone to be better, and that is definitely the case. Okay, so I'm definitely not accusing anybody of being slouches. Everyone's really trying to bring their A game right now. But again, in a world where maybe one of these formats becomes dominant, okay, those dynamics can change. Okay, and then those incentives change, and the dynamics of pricing changes. Not that pricing is cheap now. So these are the things that keep me up at night. That to me, I think are more things to think of if you're trying to think, how you're going to build and store your data for the next 10 years. Because at the end of the day, you want to be migrating between formats and storage and all this stuff every few years. You really want to kind of have your data in a format that you can kind of build and grow on, so you can focus on other problems. Because there's really a lot of other things you got to think about. Okay, right now, once you have like your data management figured out, then you actually have to use the data and put the data to use. So, this is not a problem you want to be continuously having to think about and reevaluate from top to bottom. Okay, so that's why right now there is so much thought going into the data lakehouse, because everyone sees this as a great option to move forward with, but they only want to make this movement once. They want to make this movement, and that be the way they do things, so they can focus on building AI models, building dashboards, doing machine training models, all the other stuff. Okay, getting the data in there, like not just sort of like what the platform looks like. So those are my thoughts on that. Again, I'll link to the blog that I wrote in the podcast description, but have a great day and enjoy. I'll see y'all later.